So last month, Cameron told me I should read the new William Logan Omnibus review. Logan, of course, publishes a review, a group review. It's just sort of a series of reviews all in a row of books that have come out recently in poetry. And he is, of course, best known for his savage hatchet jobs, though he is also known to champion the occasional beginner. And he publishes one of these omnibuses twice a year, once in June and once in December, in the pages of the much discussed New Criterion. So I do typically read these and find them sometimes entertaining, very readable, sometimes insightful, though I do tend to feel like I read in a different way than Logan. And I am much more likely to dislike what he dislikes than I am to like what he likes. But I also like plenty of poets that he has trashed. So I do feel, I feel like getting trashed by Logan is a rite of passage for certain poets. In fact, truly, like if he trashes you, you have made it as a poet. I think that's probably a pretty universal rule. I think that's probably true. Like if he praises you, you haven't necessarily made it, but if he trashes you, you've made it. So I did read it eventually. I had a lot going on in December, and it took me a while to get around to it. But I read it the other day, and it blew my mind, not because it was the best omnibus he'd ever written or the worst, but because it was just so full of weird shit. I suspect, I'm going to typecast Cameron here for a second. I suspect that the reason he liked it was that it said that most formal poets are terrible, and B, said that Ishii and Hutchinson is great. I suspect that might be why Cameron was into it. Just a guess. But he does say those things, but he says a bunch of other things, and I found myself like both irritated at him, just sort of disappointed by some of his, I thought, like lazy characterizations, and really thrilled by some of the decisions he made as a reviewer, one in particular. I also found myself having this very particular response to him, which is a response that's been closely examined by ContraPoints. Natalie Wynn is a YouTuber Alice has gotten me really into recently. She makes what she calls video essays, and I do think that's a pretty good name for them, about a variety of topics. A lot of the essays have a single word as the title: shame, envy, beauty, etc. And I think she is kind of a genius. I also think I think there are plenty of people who dislike her, but if you are a straight man over the age of 50, and maybe the cutoff is even younger if you don't live in like a major metropolitan area, if you don't live in New York or Chicago or LA or somewhere, you know what major metropolitan areas are. Like if you're a straight man over 45, 50, and you have not, and like a large part of your life has not involved like spending intimate time with visual or performance artists, I'll say. I'm making too many, this is already like way too qualified a claim to be even interesting. But if that is you, then I think she just may not be up your alley. Like she may not be for you. I think it might be like your response to her will be, this is fucking horrible. Like, what the fuck is this? Not because you're prejudiced or anything, but just because I think it will be a matter of taste, and unless you have had your tastes, I think like straight women, gay men, and women and gay men, I think, like have at least had their tastes have been acclimated to something like this in a way that I think straight men of a certain age are less likely to have been if they haven't spent a lot of time around artists. However, if you are a straight man over the age of 50 who has not spent a lot of time in the company of artists, then chances are you are pretty rich. In which case, I am very glad to have you. I mean, I'm glad to have you here even if you're not rich, but I'm very glad to have you here. Welcome. You are, you are valid. You are welcome here. Your voice is heard. And let's get you over to the Substack, because we have a special category just for you. It's called Motherfucker the Arts, and you can get the exact same subscription benefits as everyone else for a substantially higher price. So please go over there to SLEERICKETS.substack.com and sign up now. And skip ContraPoints, because she's probably not for you, but that's okay. I don't think it speaks ill of you. I just think not everything is for everybody. At any rate, the experience that ContraPoints has examined so much and that has been on my mind is what she calls in-group cringe. So this is a specific phenomenon of, I think I see it among a lot of Southerners, right? Southerners are very quick to point out like who a redneck is, or who's, North Carolina looks down on South Carolina, Georgia looks down on Florida, and so on. A motto throughout the Deep South that I heard many times growing up was "Thank God for Mississippi," because in all the rankings of wealth and education, and as my dad would sometimes say, teeth per capita, Mississippi came in at the bottom. And so thank God there was Mississippi, because it wasn't about because we are not at the bottom, at least, And so in-group cringe is when you see somebody who is enough like you that others might group you together. And when you see somebody like that, you become particularly susceptible to hypercriticism and contempt. And just discomfort at that person's excesses. When you see somebody who seems very close to you in certain ways, behaving in a tasteless way, then you cringe with this special kind of poisonous agony, which is in part critical condemnation and in part humiliated recognition. So that was, in addition to approval, disapproval, excitement, and irritation, I felt a lot of in-group cringe reading William Logan's Omnibus review from December. So I want to go through it, because I think he talked about a number of different poets, a pretty good variety of poets, and they are of, and I think there's something interesting, for good or for ill, that happens in almost every one of these segments. So I will start where I'm just going to go through these in order. So he starts with Whitney Hansen. So Whitney Hansen, I had never heard of her, but she is, as he says, a TikTok phenom. She, I looked her up. TikTok is her medium. So they're very, very short videos that I think they tend to be, I don't know what the official measurement of a TikTok video is, but they look like they're like under a minute at most. And she tends to stand in front of the camera and read directly into the camera a poem that she's written. They're very short poems. She reads them into the camera. That's the bulk of what I saw on her TikTok channel. So she has published a book. She's on the Matt Wall program. She self-published this, and then it sold so well that Penguin said, "Hey, let's get in on that." Which is much to William Logan's dismay. He is, as one would expect, extremely dismissive of Whitney Hansen. He quotes some of her poems, and they seem to me to be pretty bland and bad in the predictable ways that Instagram poems tend to be bland and bad. Here are a few that he cites. "Let me borrow the parts of you that I need to make me whole. All my hope fell like petals to the floor, along with every I love you I ever said. I have a bad habit of clinging to the people and places that have been hurting me. And these seem to be pretty representative of a lot of what I saw on her YouTube or on her TikTok channel. And these sort of could be, pretty interchangeable with a lot of other Insta poets. There's not really any distinctive voice. They are here as a, not a lot of Insta poets who publish stills for, use all lowercase, as she does as well in her book, though on her channel, she's reading this stuff aloud. None of this is remarkable to me, but William Logan's response to it I found to be sort of extraordinary. Like, what I expected was him to say, this is very bad and characterless and has no craft and doesn't respond to any tradition and doesn't do anything new, and anybody who spends any time, significant time reading poetry will be very bored by this. All of that would be completely true. I don't think it really is all that important to say, because again, the people who are likely to read William Logan, I think like the overlap between avid, sincere readers of Whitney Hansen and even spite readers of William Logan is like near zero. So I think all of that would be true, but it would be not really worth saying. But that's not real. So he does say those things, but he also says this. Such insights have all the weight of dandelion floss. I get it. It's a terrifying, uncertain world for which Gen Z is ill-equipped. To members of the greatest generation, or the boomers born to the specter of nuclear holocaust, or every new generation until the millennials took charge, wars, stock market crashes, Category 5 hurricanes, climate change, and much else seemed merely the collective fate of life on Earth. For Gen Z, it's the final exam for which they forgot to study. What the fuck are you talking about? So to read this again, just to hammer this home, what he is saying here is that the badness, the blandness, the worthlessness of these poems from a literary perspective is the product not of a lack of skill or care or craft or literacy, or not literal literacy, but she's not, one imagines she may not be all that well read, or a lack of talent. It's not any of those things. It's an hysterical response to the problems of the world, and a response that is hysterical in a uniquely Gen Z way. I'll read this long sentence again because I found it mind-blowing. To members of the greatest generation, or the boomers born to the specter of nuclear holocaust, or every new generation until the millennials took charge. To every generation until the millennials took charge. I like that he found a way to shit on the millennials, even in a review of a Gen Z poet. Whatever. Until the millennials took charge. Every generation, to every single generation up until this point, up until my shitty generation. Wars, stock market crashes, Category 5 hurricanes, climate change, and much else seemed merely the collective fate of life on Earth. For Gen Z, it's the final exam for which they forgot to study. Are you fucking kidding me? The suggestion being that if I'm assuming, because we're dealing with dandelion floss poetry, we're dealing with self-indulgent, myopic, navel-gazing, bland, shapeless, careless, unexamined, pressureless, craftless poetry. That's what we're dealing with. That is the overreaction. And the presence of that in the hand of a Gen Z poet is evidence of her generation's fundamental failure to reckon with the ordinary problems of life, like setting aside the frequency of Category 5 hurricanes or climate change, like any of these things, which, like, by the way, lots of boomers, let alone Greatest Generation members, did not consider to be the collective fate of life on Earth, because until 10 minutes ago they wouldn't acknowledge that it was real at all. So forget, that's the first problem that leapt out at me. But he's saying that everybody else until this point was a wind-bitten stoic. And it's only now that millennials and Gen Zers are running around with our hot dog fingers like chickens with their heads cut off. I just want to ask him, have you read hippie poems? Have you read the poems of the boomers when they were this age? Because they were fucking the same bullshit. I mean, Gen Xers? Do you think Gen Xers weren't whiny and hyperbolic and self-indulgent in their 20s? Are you fucking kidding me? So, after my initial shock at Logan's bizarre claim here, the story that came to mind was one that is really, the moral of this story is not anything to do with poetry. The moral is I'm an asshole. and in a particular way. There are a lot of problems with identifying, this or that behavior as autistic. Honestly, I don't really care one way or the other. Reading up on autism has helped me understand some things about myself, but, I'd be perfectly happy to call it something else. An example of an incident that, in retrospect, helped me understand that maybe there were some things that I wasn't getting about the world. I haven't a longer thought about this. I may get into it in another episode, but I was in my early 20s, and my dad designed a chapel for a Jesuit retreat. They're the ones who are I think Brian called them the Jewish lawyers of the Catholic Church. I was living in Atlanta, and I spent a fair amount of time around my grandmother and his mom, and she was going through a lot of her papers because there was a portion of the chapel that was dedicated to my late uncle. He died as a kid, as a 4-year-old. And my grandparents helped, donated some money to the chapel. And so she spent a lot of time thinking about her son. She lost him when he was 4. She was probably not all that much older than Whitney Hansen. And as one can imagine, it was her first son, not her first child, but her first son. It happened very quickly, all basically one night. Suddenly it was a rare medical condition. And she was devastated. The family was distraught. So my grandmother was, she was spending a lot of time thinking about little Alec, and talked to me about him, and was also, this sort of had prompted her to go through some of her old papers. She asked me to take a look at this. She said, I found this thing. It's a poem. She said, I didn't write it, but it's a poem about a little boy who dies very young, and about how he and about the afterlife and the sadness of the mother, and he'll be in heaven. And her friend wrote it, and her friend gave it to her when Alec died, because it's not just a poem about a mother who loses a little boy. It was about her and her little boy who had died. And she said, I found this that this friend of mine gave me all those years ago. It was written then. It was written at the time Alec died. And she gave me this all those years ago. And I've held on to it, but I only found it again recently. And, you're a poet, she said. You read a lot of poems. I wondered, could you look at this and just tell me what you think of it? Because I was thinking maybe we could put this in the chapel or something. And I said, well, this is very bad. It's extremely sentimental. Many of the sentences aren't completed in, quite grammatically satisfactory ways. it rhymes, but it doesn't have meter, and the effect is very clumsy and cloying to the ear. Many of the images are very tired and cliched, as is the basic argument, but worse than that, it hammers its point over and over again. It won't stop insisting on the triumphant return of the boy to heaven and the mother being reunited with him someday. Rather than leaving anything to the imagination, it insists and declares and makes explicit these claims again and again and again. And overall, I just think this is a truly terrible piece of writing that should not be read by anybody, let alone made public in a chapel dedicated to your son who died, about whom this poem was written by your friend who is not you. And you might not be surprised, as I was, by how upset my grandmother was. She was very angry and very hurt. And only much later, it occurred to me, I wonder if she wrote that poem. I wonder if it wasn't her friend, but she wrote it, and that was a lie meant to save face, but because she said the words, "I didn't write this," I took it that she didn't write it. And I said, I'm talking about the work of somebody else who's not present, and therefore I can be honest. That was obviously very stupid of me, but it was the kind of mistake I have made countless times in my life. And I would be less likely to make it today only because I have put together an elaborate system of kludges and tricks designed to help me decode the bizarre nonverbal ways in which people communicate with one another. I tell that story both to demonstrate my own idiocy and to make the point that William Logan is absolutely full of shit when it comes to this insane claim that there is something Gen Z-ish about Whitney Hanson's badness. No, Whitney Hanson is bad in a very, very conventional way. It is perhaps her greatest tribute to the tradition, being bad in this way. He goes on to make fun of her in lots of ways that are completely predictable. Although he says, you do wonder though what's being taught in high school when a poet thinks that all right is a word. And I agree with him that all right has not been a word traditionally. It certainly was not a word when I was growing up, and I still don't write it as a word. But like most spell checks and autocorrects now will turn it into a word. When I type in all right on my phone, it will say, did you mean all right? So I guess he lives on a Jesuit retreat with no cell phones allowed, because he seems not to be at all aware of that. So this is one of the lines that he said that made me feel in-group cringe. Hanson loves to tag poems with new age phrases that should have been forcibly retired when baristas started getting tips for tats. I guess he's having fun with the evocation of the expression tit for tat, and maybe the coy implication that it's not the tats that the baristas are getting tips for. But this is a bizarre, this is such a crazy, it's not just that it's not fair, it's that I don't know what he's talking about. When baristas started getting tips for tats, I think he's doing a weird old person conflation here, where he's saying around the time that I started noticing that there were such a thing as baristas, and I started noticing that baristas seemed to want tips because they were doing more than just pouring coffee from a pot. And when lots of normal people in the world just seem to have tattoos all the time. He's saying, I noticed all these things as an old person, and they all seem to run together. And then he turns them into a single phenomenon that just makes no sense at all. What barista gets tips for tats? Where is that a policy? Where is that even a convention? Even at places where there are baristas and they have tattoos and there's a tip cup out, I don't know of anybody who said like, oh, I'm going to tip you because of that tattoo you have. Even if they're saying I'm going to tip you because you're cute, they're still not saying I'm going to tip you because of your tattoo. It's like, I see that, and it's, it doesn't matter. It's not an important note, but it makes me cringe so hard because I see that and I think like, no, William, you're much older than I am. But like, people are going to think of me as being that kind of white guy. Like that kind of annoying, crusty, old, out of touch white guy. Like, no, don't do that. You're making us look bad. He makes one other really weird claim that this didn't make me cringe, it just made me confused. He dismisses Hansen along with various other popular poets, including Rod McEwen and Rupi Kaur, as being this sort of poets who become unaccountably popular. Oh, that was he says this thing that made me crazy. He said, in order to become a TikTok phenom, you need the special gift of dumbing up to your audience. And that, like, again, that just feels like, oh God, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Like, go on TikTok, look. The first thing you will notice is that she is a not just very pretty young blonde girl, but that she also is very weirdly interesting looking. For one thing, her eyes are really strange. They're two different colors, and they're not even the same two different colors. They look like something's wrong with them in a really hypnotic way. Like, I watched a lot of her videos listening to meaningless poems that washed right over me just because her eyes are so weird looking. And like, even if you give her no credit for any skill, for any marketing, for any, instinct for what's going to appeal to people, even if you give her no credit for any of that, like, at least be aware that like, it's not her gift for dumbing up to her audience that makes her a phenom. Like, that just feels like really weird, out of touch white guy curmudgeonliness. Like, that's like, if you're going to mock the medium, like, at least understand it well enough to mock it accurately. Like, there's plenty of, like, you can say people become TikTok phenoms because they are attractive and good at editing or something like this, or like good at dancing in a particular way, or they love sensation. They'll make sensational videos, or they'll do unethical things to people in public and put them on video. Like, you could make lots of criticisms of TikTok that are valid, but like, no, that's not what this is. I mean, it is dumb, and I don't think that reading these poems or listening to these poems is in any way rewarding. But like, it's like he's not even trying to understand the thing he's dismissing. And that impulse to dismiss something without even trying to understand it feels to me like such a in-group cringe, crusty old white guy thing to do that it makes me say like, God damn it, William, you're making us look bad. The last thing he does say that as I said, just confused me was this. And I really don't know what to say about it except like, what? So he says after shitting on all the Insta poets, he says, readers satisfied by the Insta poets. He says, readers so easily satisfied never want poetry more demanding and don't really understand what poetry is for. They don't understand what poetry is for. That is, to chasten and subdue. I'll read that again. Readers so easily satisfied never want poetry more demanding and don't really understand what poetry is for. That is, to chasten and subdue. Like, I don't love it when people cite, Horace /Frost /everyone and by claiming that the goal of poetry is to delight and instruct. Like, I have qualms with that claim, but like, that claim at least makes a kind of a sense. And like, lots of people do believe that, and I think sincerely. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody say, even a loosely paraphrased version of this, that what poetry is really for is to chasten and subdue. Like, to give a talking to humble us, to bring us down a peg, to make us quieter, more still, to keep us from doing things to put us to sleep. Like, what are you talking about? I also, like, the weird thing is, like, this doesn't even especially jibe with what I know of his own preferences. He tends to like very prickly, sonically and linguistically dense poems. I mean, he's a big fan of Geoffrey Hill. Geoffrey Hill's like mere presence could seem kind of chastening, but I don't think that's like, is that what William Logan goes to poetry for? Like, it's really hard for me to imagine somebody going to poetry voluntarily in order to be chastened and subdued. Like, I don't even have an argument here with Logan. This line just baffled me. What? Please do write in if what? But I'll go on because that's just the first of many people that he reviewed here. So he reviews Terrance Hayes next. This is Terrance Hayes' first book since American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin. This one is called So to Speak. I think based on the quotations and the timing, I think this book contains a lot of Hayes's animal poems, which I did talk about with Alice on a previous episode, in which, I mean, the ones I read were very, very bad. Were very flat and limp and self-indulgent, and seemed to be, the thing I think I said about them at the time was like, well, it seems like he's trying to do something really different from what he did in his last book, and I give him credit for that. But at the time, I said, like, well, there's no need to be publishing this in the New Yorker. Like, work on something new, totally. Like, that's great. Try out a new kind of, like, all of that's, of course, wonderful, definitely. He's extremely talented, extremely skillful, as is evident, reading his last book, and plenty of other poems as well outside that book. In the animal poems I read since that book, and that I believe are included in So to Speak, it seemed to be doing something he really didn't know how to do yet, and that was very unpleasant to read. And he seems not only to have published those in the New Yorker, but also to have published them in a poetry collection. Logan is pretty harsh about this, but he also acknowledges Hayes's gifts, and it is the kind of bad review he gives where he basically says, like, this is a really good poet who could be doing much better work than the work he's doing in this book. And that, to me, is not a kind of review anybody likes to read about himself. I should say we love to read about other people. But it's a kind of review I think is sort of worth writing and is, meaningful. Is like not a terrible thing to do as a critic. But I had so many other moments in this review where I kept experiencing that in-group cringe. Here's a sentence he says about Terrance Hayes that just made me feel like such a bad, crusty old white guy. And I just thought, like, oh God, William, you can't say that. Don't say that. He says of Terrance Hayes, Pulitzer Prize winner, MacArthur genius. I mean, I think like very celebrated, very lauded, teaches at some fancy university. He says of Terrance Hayes, he says, he embodies Black culture with the knowing ear of hip hop. Don't say that, William. Don't say that. I mean, it's not. That is like the poetry reviewer equivalent of saying, "Oh, the man who helped me at the liquor store, he was a very a well-spoken African American gentleman." I mean, it's not even that this makes crusty old white guys look bad. It's that it doesn't make sense. Terrance Hayes embodies Black culture. So it's not that Terrance Hayes is a Black poet or that his poems deal with Black culture or that he participates in other aspects of Black culture. It's that he embodies black culture, which I don't know. I'm not sure how you would measure that. And if you could measure it, I'm not sure if it would be really quite true of Terrance. What would it mean? I certainly don't think William Logan knows what it means, except that he is a black guy who writes poems. He embodies black culture. Like, he is the avatar of black culture, is what he's saying. And then he mixes metaphors in the weirdest way. He says, with the knowing ear of hip hop. So he embodies it with an ear for one thing, which is real clumsy. But then the knowing ear of hip hop. I mean, there is such a thing as having a good ear for hip hop, like for having an ear that is used to listening to a lot of rap music. And there is such a thing as a knowing quality in hip hop, right? Hip hop involves a lot of linguistic compression, a lot of slang, a lot of speech that is limited to initiates, a lot of you have to know already in advance what's being talked about in order to understand what's being said. But I don't know what the ear of hip hop is. I don't know that I would even say of a person, oh, he has a really knowing ear. But what is the ear of hip hop? Like, hip hop has an ear, and it is with that ear that Terrance Hayes embodies black culture, that he becomes the figure representative of all black culture in the form of the ear of hip hop. It's a truly nonsensical like, the only thing this sentence seems to mean is, I am a weird old white guy who noticed that this poet is black, and now I feel obliged to say something about it. He does praise some of the lines of Hayes's in particular, and it is in these moments that I felt very much aware of the distance between Logan as a reader and me as a reader. Not because I disliked these lines, but just because I think for him, and this is how, when he praises, often his praise consists of, check this line out. He did somewhere, I forget where it was, somewhere in this review, he did say, like, anyone who could write this line is bad, which is the most ridiculous claim. I forget where it is, it's somewhere in. But then he does this other thing, which is, like, anybody who could write these lines is a true poet. So he says, think how much is contained in her and the pigtailed cashier from the corner store stole the preacher's 2-pound Bible. A poet who can write about a woman dreaming of the ephemera of souls lost between African and American shores, a blue between the sky and shark parlor, loveliest as the loveliest of the sisters to leap into the waters and live free as the bride of the sea, is capable of more than this deeply flawed, frenzied yet lazy book. Also, don't say lazy. William Logan, don't say lazy. I do sometimes think that, at least in the case of the American Sonnets, like, I sort of wish Terrance Hayes had, like, been a little choosier, maybe spent a little longer, because he sort of boasted about writing the whole thing extremely quickly. But, like, don't make the last adjective of your review late. Just come on. You're making us look so bad, William. And I don't object to the lines, her and the pigtailed cashier from the corner store stole the preacher's 2-pound Bible. There is a lot of story implied there. Well, I mean, maybe not a lot of story, but, like, there is some story implied there. The ephemera of souls lost between African and American. The ephemera of souls. I actually have a little bit of a hard time understanding that. Oh, okay. The ephemera of souls, like the forgettable, perishable little incidental artifacts of souls, as in human beings, lost between African American as adjectives, but also in the next line, or the next stanza, we learn that the noun they modify is shores. So during the Middle Passage, which was famously brutal and deadly for many slaves in transit, A blue between the sky and shark parlor. There were people thrown to the sharks, some of them still alive along the way. Lovely as the loveliest of the sisters to leap into the waters. Some captives jumped into the waters, the same, as the people who jumped from the Twin Towers. There's a lot of really powerful history there. I'm ambivalent about these lines as poetry, particularly taken in isolation. They don't strike me as shockingly good poetry on their own. Again, the subject matter is extremely powerful, but more to the point, so what is it then that is praiseworthy about this, William? All he says is, think how much is contained. And then worse, in the second example, in the longer passage, he just says, a poet who can write this can write better than this book. Well, so why? What's there? Show us. That I would love to hear what it is that makes these lines so good. Again, I am interested in them. I think I could be persuaded that they are very good. Right now, I think I don't quite know enough, beyond the subject matter to know if these lines in particular are really special, but more this is the heart of what makes poetry to Logan, and he is so reluctant to say what it actually is. In the next section, he does this thing, and this was what blew my mind in a really good way. He does a really unusual thing in a contemporary poetry review, particularly in a major publication. Well, New Criterion is, maybe not major, but it's got a bit of a profile. And I certainly have not seen him do this before. He may have. I haven't seen it exactly. But he says he reviews an old book. So he reviews Catherine Tufariello's book, Keeping My Name, which came out in 2006. So she had one other book before that, but I don't know if it was a chapbook or if it counts. I think he refers to this as her first book. Yeah, so this is called her first book, and I think it did win a first book prize. It's called Keeping My Name. Came out in 2006. He says, just shy of 2 decades ago, Catherine Tufariello's first book was met with the applause of a number of enthusiastic reviews. That stunning debut never enjoyed a sequel. I missed Keeping My Name at the time, but I'm going to review it, let us say, a little belatedly. And he praises it. He says it's really good. And I am convinced by his praise, although I don't always agree with his explanation. Or rather, I should say, I agree with his praise. I'm not necessarily convinced of his explanation. He focuses a lot on the way in which she is good as a formal poet in contrast to most formal poets. He says, Tufariello is a formal poet in all the best senses and few of the worst. That is, the poems rise out of meter freshly and without regard for the old war between free verse and verse formal. I don't disagree with that claim exactly, but I'm not sure it means anything. They rise out of meter freshly, but they seem fresh. They don't seem stale. Without regard for the old war between verse free and verse formal. I don't know that that's a claim you could make about a book of poems. Unless the poems would be taking active part in that argument. If the poems were making an argument about form or free verse. It just seems to be a way of saying these formal poems didn't annoy me like a lot of formal poems do. He says after that, I think something that makes a little bit more sense, which is that there's no strain between the thought and the action if the action is the poem itself, meaning that it doesn't seem like this is an idea that has been forced into verse, nor does it feel like this is just verse that is concocting an idea on the spot. It feels like the two go naturally together. And that, I think, is a virtue. It's certainly one I prize, the seeming spontaneity of very graceful. The best thing he does is just quote from good poems of hers. He quotes from this. He says, her elegy for an old friend who died after they lost touch ends with an invocation of the Iliad, which they once studied together. the end of the poem is, I never dreamed that you would not grow old. That time had stopped for you as suddenly as for the daughters of weeping Hecate in burning Troy. The unremembered ones you summoned from the ashes in the fall of 1983, when you were asked to translate the catalogue of Priam's sons. Hard to believe that you will not return and tell your adventures in the other world, no matter how tenderly I brush the dead leaves from your sleeping face and call your name. It's just so gently and quietly done. No matter how tenderly I brush the dead leaves from your sleeping face and call your name. Yeah, just very quietly suggests sweeping off the grave marker in order to read the name aloud. And of course, we know gravestones were originally meant to be read aloud. Yeah, so he just quotes that. And I think that is as effective as any of his actual praise. And I think this is such a great idea. Like, especially if you are somebody who has a little bit of a reputation, just to take a moment sometimes in your reviews to say, like, oh, you know what? Let's talk about this old book that probably you haven't heard of that's really good. That seems to me like the claim that we should not be, we should never write negative reviews because we should only be calling attention to really good books of poems. I think there are problems with that argument. I think that they make the most sense when you're talking about obscure poet. I don't think it makes sense to publish like negative reviews of poets you've never heard of anyway. But I think there aren't that many really good books of poems that come out, and there certainly aren't enough for all of the reviews to be written of them. For lots of reviews to come out of new books of poems. Poetry tends to have a little bit more tolerance for slow reviews than, certainly than fiction does. But this seems to me like a really good answer to that. Like, well, maybe we don't need to have all reviews of books from the last year or two. Maybe go back and find us some deep cuts that we don't know about from 20 years ago, from 40 years ago, and write a proper present day 1,000-word review of those. Like, that seems like a great idea. I'm so glad he did that. If I didn't know better, I might have thought he got the idea from my episode of Bill Coyle, whose book came out, I think, the same year. But I know that's not the case, because I truly cannot imagine a world in which William Logan listens to this podcast. But I think this was such a great idea. I was so excited he did it. I also like Catherine Tufariello's poems. He does, however, then do this really weird thing. He quotes another poem, Moving Day, which is really good. I watch her sweep each changed familiar room and listen as her broom draws shadows out of sleep. Its song, the whisper of leaves whirling in papery swarms of snow under sweeping arms. Below, the furnace heaves a sigh, and so does she, still plying the rhythmic oar that rows us over the floor, through the door and out to sea. And he ends by, he sort of builds a little in-joke into the review where he cites her use of a Greek verb that means to be about to do but then not to do, to leave undone. And he cites that verb again at the end as a way of saying, you left something undone here, meaning, this was your first book and we never got a second book. But in doing so, he makes a really weird claim about Tufariello. He says, to this poet who walked away from her gifts, I can only remind her of that Greek verb she mentions in her elegy, mellow, which sounds funny in English, but is I think the pronunciation of the verb. Mellow, Catherine Tufariello, mellow. But I read that and I thought, oh God, did Catherine Tufariello die? What happened to her? Because we published her a few years ago in Literary Matters, and I looked online and found a couple more poems she published in 2021, and I know there are poets like Taylor Pius who publish 50 poems in a year, but I certainly have gone 2 or 3 years without publishing any poems. Joshua Megan, went a criminally long time without publishing poems. I'm still, urging him every time I talk to him to send in some more poems to us. Send some more of these. I know he's got them. He's got poems. He hasn't been sending them out. But I thought, did Catherine Tufariello walk away from her gifts? That's terrible news. because I didn't think she had. I thought she was just slowly publishing a little bit at a time over a long stretch. And like, yes, 17 years, 18 years now, I guess, is a pretty long time between first and second book. But like, she hasn't walked away from her gifts. She's just slow and careful, man. Like that's fuck. You scared me. I wrote to somebody I knew was friends with her, and heard back right before recording this that, yeah, it's like as far as we know, she's still out there writing really good poems. Yeah, so I think unless he talked to her and he knows more than we do, I think he's wrong about her walking away from her gifts. But I just think this was a really great thing to do in a review. And I think it's a great precedent. And I hope he does it more, and I hope more other people do it as well. He then does something that I appreciate. I think I'm less moved by it, but I thought it was also a really good thing to do in a review, which is spend some time talking about translation. So he reviews Emily Wilson's new version of the Iliad, and he starts with 5.5 good-sized paragraphs about the English tradition of translating Homer, and who's done it well, who's done it not so well, what the various problems are. He talks a lot about Pope, who translated both Iliad and Odyssey into heroic couplets, that is, rhyming lines of iambic pentameter, rhyming AABBCC. He praises Pope, but he says Pope's facility often plays fast and loose with the Homeric original, but his sprezzatura is matched only by the compaction and charged language that still resonates centuries down the line, as well as by the nimble rhyming that must have been like trying to ride a unicycle on the backs of two polar bears. Pope's lines blister with energy, even within Augustan rigidity, but he had the advantage of being able to expand at will. His Iliad is 3,000 lines longer than Homer's. He also, so I've only read maybe 2 or 3 books of Pope's Iliad because I found it almost impossible to read. I like Alexander Pope a lot, and I love the Iliad, and I just found it really hard to get through, like just sort of physically difficult to bring my brain through it. In part, that was, and maybe I'm a weirdo, but like in part it's because he constantly shifts between past and present tense, like constantly, and he does it almost always in order to make a rhyme, and I just like that just drove me so insane. I couldn't take it. I couldn't keep going. But it's a really important translation. It has a big role in the English tradition of poetry as well as of translation. He talks about Robert Fitzgerald's translation, which I love. Richmond Lattimore's, he's a little harder on Robert Fagel's. And then he praises Christopher Logue's, bizarre non-translation. But he says, Logue's Homer is what Achilles would have written in his psychotic rage. All of this seems like virtuous service to perform as a reviewer. Like William Logan is a well-educated, well-read reviewer. He does actually know Greek, which is rare, even for poetry reviewers. I certainly don't know Greek. But this seemed like, this is a really good thing for a poetry review to do. And it's for a popular audience. This is not for Christopher Childers. This is for a popular reader. And that just seems like that's like that and the True for Yellow excavation are really she's not being excavated. I want to suggest that her book was being excavated. So that's only 17 years old. But like writing a review of that older book, writing a review of Emily Wilson in which he spends a good deal of time talking about what makes translations of Homer good, bad, and indifferent in English, and then he talks at more length about Wilson. Again, though, he says it's serviceable. He says, Emily Wilson, the first woman to translate the Odyssey into English, has now contributed a very readable Iliad that rattles along like a battle chariot, intent, but more mechanical than moving. There's no pressure or tension in the language that Fitzgerald, following Pope, left more electrified. I haven't read Wilson's translation, but that seems at least like a coherent, reasonable review, like reasonable verdict, and a useful one, particularly for a popular audience that might be more likely to at some point read the Odyssey. Oh, Yeah. Oh, sorry. So she's done both the Odyssey and now the Iliad. Yeah, both of them. But like, maybe a popular reader is more likely to encounter these books, or at least portions of them, than most poetry collections. And this just seems like a really good thing for a smart, well-read reviewer to do. But a lot of his criticism of her is of her meter. She writes in blank verse, as does Fitzgerald. I think that was Lattimore as well. I'm not sure. So iambic pentameter like Pope, but unrhymed, which does seem to be the better choice for the subject matter. Like, I don't know that Homer would ever sound quite right in that much rhyme. Like, I think Fitzgerald uses rhyme a little bit, and occasionally he has, I think Hermes speaks in rhyme, but not fucking like relentlessly. But Logan scans Wilson's verse very critically, and then the criticism he makes, I'm very confused. So here's what he says about her verse. When Ezra Pound read the messy drafts of the Wasteland, he marked parts of the opening of a game of chess, the first section of the Wasteland. Is that the first section? Or is that the second section? Fuck, I forget. That's the section with the unhappy couple. As too tum-pum at a stretch, and too penty, he'd have had a field day with Wilson. We expect Pope's meter to be highly regular, as was Augustan practice. He, Pope, disapproved of Shakespeare's thundering versification. She, Wilson, has translated these 15,000 lines while neglecting what blank verse requires not to sound machined into being. So there is something that blank verse requires in order not to sound machined into being, and she neglects that something. He goes on, poets learned, quite quickly in fact, to make pentameter sound more like Proteus than single-minded Achilles. She ti-tum, 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 ti-tums all the way through, striding in lead boots. He then gives a little primer on substitutions in iambic pentameter. He calls them variations, but if iambic pentameter is theoretically a line of 5 iambs, 5 tatum feet, then there are substitutions of other feet, other types of little rhythmic units that you can slot into certain positions. So a very common substitution is a first position trochee. Another very common substitution is a fifth position. You could call it an amphibrach, or you usually just call it a feminine foot. So a first position trochee would be ta-tum. Fifth position feminine foot would be ta-tum-ti. And there's various other substitutions along the way, and he talks through all of these. He does give the example of an ionic double foot, which is sort of like a doubled iamb. So instead of da-dum, you get da-da-dum-dum, ti-ti-tum-tum. And that's true. That does appear in plenty of lines of iambic pentameter. I just think that, for those who are really fussy, and I don't know if Logan is this sort, but for the people who get real fussy about, the non-existence of pyrrhics and spondees, to then say, let me put it this way, if you believe in an ionic double foot, that's fine, but you also believe in pyrrhics and spondees, because da-da-dum-dum might be an ionic double foot, but it's also a pyrrhic followed by a spondee, which is what I would typically call that. So whatever. I think this is also probably useful, maybe not as useful as his general overview of translations of Homer into English, but he digs into just the sort of the little, he goes a few feet off the trail into the weeds with meter. And that's it, and I think that's fine. The trouble is that his real criticism of Wilson is that she's too regular. She's thuddingly, ti-tummingly regular. His closing, his extremely predictable closing line is, every copy of her Iliad should have been boxed with a, say it with me, metronome. The classic insult. leveled at poets who write formal verse that is too sing-songy. It is metronomic. It is mechanical. I was a little bit confused when I read the passage he scanned. So here's the passage. Furious at the son of Atreus, the god spread deadly plague throughout the camp, so that the common troops began to die, because their leader, Agamemnon, treated Chryses, Apollo's priest, with disrespect. The priest had come towards the swift Greek ships, and faced the warriors bedecked in bronze, to free his daughter with a countless ransom. So as he notes, there are two feminine feet, non-treated and less ransom, and there's a first position trochee, fury us at, but he scans this as being pretty regular throughout. He does identify, I guess, what maybe he's not a, Chryses is another trochee, and then I guess he's not a spondy truther. he believes in spondies because he marks a spondy in the 5th foot of the antepenultimate line. But here's his scansion. Furious at the son. I'm wildly exaggerating in order to really emphasize what the scansion is here. But furious at the son of Atreus, the god spread deadly plague throughout the camp, so that the common troops began to die, because their leader Agamemnon treated Chryses, Apollo's priest, with disrespect. The priest had come towards the swift Greek ships, and faced the warriors bedecked in bronze, to free his daughter with a countless ransom. I mean, I mostly agree with that scansion, I guess. But my criticism of it would not be that it's too regular. It would be that it's not naturally regular enough. And as Shane pointed out many episodes ago, for a very long time, most poets writing in accentual syllabic meter, in English at least, were trying to be really regular. I think there is this bizarre idea that in order to be good, like, on the one hand, they're the Joseph Slemies who, like, literally believe substitutions are blasphemous. I mean, I don't know if he thinks they're blasphemous, but he thinks they're wrong. He thinks you should not have any substitutions in poetry, and to include any substitutions is a sin against poetry. And that's obviously very silly. But there is a pretty widely accepted belief that there's a real danger, and the danger is that you're not going to have enough substitutions, and your lines are going to be too regular. And I guess like that, sure, that does happen, but in my experience, like, much more common is that you see people doing what she's doing here, which is straining to make the meter, because their leader Agamemnon treated Chryses, Apollo's priest, with disrespect. The priests had come towards the swift Greek ships, and faced the warriors bedecked in bronze. I mean, he makes fun of a countless ransom, and he talks about the problems with that. But like here, I just see somebody with an okay grasp of meter, who doesn't really have a natural ear for it, who hasn't really worked it into her muscle memory, trying to be sure to fill out the lines with words that will technically scan. And they do technically scan. I mean, yeah, my criticism here would be, I don't hear the meter clearly enough. I hear you laboring to make it. The problem is not that you need to throw in more substitutions and mix it up more. Logan's, harsh condemnation of her is, I came across a stretch of 14 lines a little later that had no variations at all. That's not the problem. Like, there's a, I can't remember who came up with it, but like, there's a system of scansion that uses 5 values so that each syllable is stressed on a 1 to 5 scale. And that's probably more accurate. I think it was certainly more accurate because there's not really such a thing as a binary stressed, unstressed distinction. There is, of course, a range. It's much more like what I say is like put 10 people in a row and mark the ones that are tall versus the ones that are short. And of course, they're all different heights. They're not just two different heights, but you can align them in such a way that the contrast is short, tall, short, tall, short, tall, short, tall, tall, short, tall. And what you will see in that alignment is that there's variation, is that some of the talls are taller, some of the shorts are shorter. In fact, it's even possible to have a person who would be a short in one position be a tall in another position, right? And that same thing is true in verse, right? The trick is to have enough practice at it that you can do it without it seeming strained. Here, the problem is not that I hear the metronome. The problem is that I see her working to meet the metronome. If you write really good, I use substitutions. Substitutions are great. Substitutions are fine. There's plenty of very loose iambic pentameter that I love. I have no qualms with substitutions. But I also think it's possible to write very regular iambic pentameter that has a lot of the natural variation that you get because you're using a language. They're not Legos. They scan like Legos, but they're not Legos. They're words. I think it's possible to have relatively limited variations, relatively limited substitutions, and still be pretty pleasing to the ear and not come off as metronomic. I mean, maybe this is what metronomic means. It means that I'm hearing you strain to meet the meter. But the problem is not that you need more substitutions. That is not what's going on here. And that I just find that criticism so weird. It seems so obviously incorrect. And it's one, he's certainly not alone in making it. But Josh, Shane, those of you who actually know more about meter than I do, maybe you can weigh in. But Elijah, yeah, that just felt to me no, you're missing there is a thing to say here, but that's not it. All right, he goes on to talk about Nicole Seeley's book, The Ferguson Report and Erasure, which has come up some on this podcast. I'm not going to say a whole lot about it because I've already gone down that garden path. He's dismissive of erasure as a form, and he's pretty critical of this book. He basically says that most of this feels very bland and preachy. If I wanted to be hectored, I'd take classes at the Jory Graham School of Didactic Confession. I don't know. I haven't read enough Jory Graham to know if that's funny. I was surprised to hear that there are only 8 poems in the book. That she takes all the pages and she makes 8 poems out of them. That seems like a small number, though, I don't know. I haven't done erasure poems. He brought up at least some interesting questions about erasure as a form. So she prints both the words, the poems compressed on their own, as well as the poems in their original context. So she prints out the Ferguson Report in faint gray, and then she highlights her words in sharp black. He says the longer the gap between useful letters, however, and I guess I did know this because I'd seen one of these on the New Yorker website, but it hadn't really come home that she's not taking whole words, she's taking letters, and she's composing her own words. And that makes 8 poems out of 80 pages. That seems like, if you get to pick just the individual letters, that seems like not very many poems. But it also to me, it just brought up an interesting question, which is there are some formal delineations to make. One could imagine a version of an erasure that would say, well, you have to take whole words, and that would have that would be a much greater constraint. My instinct is to say it might be a more interesting one than just being able to take letters willy-nilly. She does impose on herself a rule that is, as he says, the poet seems to have a rule that the words she finds must use only the letters in a single line of the parent text. And that seems like a good rule. That is, if you're going to have a bunch of different letters from different words form one word, all of those words have to appear in the same line of text. The problem is that she then changes the formatting to make the lines super, super long and the type really, really small. And that, again, like that seems like a formal question to ask about erasure. I think like maybe it's just my instinct for, like my preference for coherence over incoherence, but I do think that if you're going to draw out text from an original and make something new with it, I will just say like I tend to be more interested in more coherent, complete utterances that are extracted from that original rather than impressionistic poems. So he cites with praise the lines horses, hundreds, neighing, part reflex, part reason, part particular urge. At gunpoint, among them, you are. Less likely to live, into the wild go the captive born. I do like less likely to live, into the wild go the captive born. Part of what I like about that is that like that's a taut, spring-loaded, complete sentence that contains a real significance to it. Yeah, even in its like slight inversion of ordinary construction, it almost seems to kind of enact the subject, that it's sort of launching these people who are, animals in this case, who are less likely to survive in the wild. Less likely to live, into the wild go the captive born. That's really good. Whereas horses, hundreds, neighing, part reflex, part reason, part particular urge is fine, but like especially when I know that that's taken letter by letter from like many pages, I think like, well, you couldn't make a sentence out of it. But again, that may be me making crusty old white guys look bad rather than William. Come on, Matthew. The poem ends, whoever said death comes in threes is an optimist. That's a good line. That's actually 2 lines, but it's a good 2 lines. And Logan seems to agree there. The sharp images and self-possession soon give way, alas, to an earnestness that diminishes what might have been a saving grace, finding poetry where it doesn't belong. Yeah, his response is a mixed bag. But I did think that, like, insofar as he takes up a form newly of interest in poetry today, and he gives it a little bit of attention on its own, that to me seems, again, like a good thing for poetry reviewers to do. So resurrect old books, discuss translation and tradition of translation, and discuss forms as forms in their own right, rather than merely as things to be apologized for or avoided or hidden. And then he ends with Ishmael Hutchinson, unsurprisingly, because he does love Hutchinson, as does Cameron. I did find some of his praise, as with his praise of Terrance Hayes. Well, hold on a minute. I'm praising him for just quoting Two for Yellow, and I'm giving him shit for just quoting Hayes and Hutchinson. Maybe I'm just being a racist old jerk. So maybe that's fine. Maybe he's just, when he quotes people, he's just quoting them, and that's all you can say. Because when he tries to explain what's good about Two for Yellow, that often feels a little more dubious. But here's what he says about Hutchinson. Hutchinson is the most verbally gifted of the younger poets now reaching maturity, if by maturity we mean about 40. School of Instructions, this is new book, is dense as a sandstorm, but the writing is charged with a passion rare since the salad days of Geoffrey Hill, leaving in its compression and difficulty a hillish aftertaste. Here are the soldiers during training. Later they will climb the sea-charged cannons and look up the school's purple and gray wall, huddle in the breeze, quiet, awaiting the bugle. Brass rasps the air iodine. That felt like the most Cameronish line quoted in this review. Brass rasps the air iodine. Then the scurrilous voices crossed strict waves, bound by an ardor to move while crouching hidden in the open, an infantry stalled in the holy metal of the sun. Logan does reserve a lot of praise for Hutchinson, specifically for not getting political. He seems to be very excited that Hutchinson is a young or youngish, young for a poet, black poet writing about colonial history without getting all political, without what he says, making his poem into a knee-jerk op-ed piece on the sins of empire. Again, like, Logan seems a little too excited about that aspect of that non-aspect of these poems. Like, he's so excited that it's not preachy. It's not from the Jory Graham school of didactic confession. Though he seems to want to make it more confessional. He says he wishes that this poem had mixed in more of Hutchinson's own person. One could have read the poem as a poet's means of coming to terms, as Derek Walcott did, with a childhood mixed in heritage united by division. I think like he compares him to Walcott a couple times in this review. I don't know, like, he doesn't seem, his language is dense and Walcott's language is dense. It seems pretty different from Walcott. And I think, like, part of what makes it really different is, from the lines he quoted above, from the lines he quotes elsewhere, just sort of citing, like, he says, the poet shows a fidelity to poetic means that earns the reader's trust. A fidelity to poetic means that earns the reader's trust. So the reader's trust is earned when you show that you're faithful to poetic means. Do you write poems with poem stuff, with poem matter, in the way that poems are supposed to be written? A, I'm not sure what that means, and B, I'm not sure if or why that earns readers' trust. But the lines he cites here are, a boy struggled with a flag, crack lashing from his hands like a fer de lance being a snake, sails the air stagnate, white flashes of sharks haunting fevers strangers shared in the hulls, the sea the broad church of night and day, brittle Bible sheets of his Britannica ached countries under his thumbs. He lifted his fingers. There were new borders and some countries had changed their names. I am impressed the way I have been by Hutchinson when I've read him in the past. He says, Hutchinson can hardly write a line without charging it with gunpowder. That seems really right. That seems like a very apt piece of praise. It does seem to be what Logan cares about most. It is also what Cameron cares about most. I find his poems hard to read because it does seem to be line after line after line charged with gunpowder. And what does not seem to be present in the poems of his I have read or in these lines is a recognizable voice. Brass rasps the air iodine. That is a kind of compression one doesn't see everywhere. One does see it in like, that seems like that could be Hill, certainly. Maybe Walcott, though the thing about Walcott is, like, Walcott is often dense and not always my favorite, but he does tend to have a pretty perceptible voice. Like, I really do hear Walcott speaking, or like a Walcott, a poet voice speaking in all of the poems of his I have read. It doesn't feel like just an artful hand compressing language, which is what this feels like, which is what Hopkins feels like, which is what some of Hill, but not all of Hill that I've read feels like. I don't hear a voice. And again, that's fine. He may not need it. I mean, he clearly doesn't need that. He certainly doesn't need me to hear it. But it does mean that I find it very difficult to read these poems. Logan closes by saying, I'd give up. This is a really weird piece of hyperbole. He makes this seemingly hyperbolic claim that I would argue is actually not a claim at all. It's saying almost nothing. He says, I'd give up whole books by many poets for Hutchinson's lines. The battalion stood thousands upon thousands of restless shadows, casting no shadows on the sand. He says, it's high noon, of course, but it's a lot more than that. The soldiers in the story are black. They're fighting in the British infantry during World War I in the desert. This is, the image of, the dark skin in these uniforms and in this context is evoked. It's also high noon, so there are literal shadows on the ground. Race has a large part to play in the story or in the history that Hutchinson is drawing from. But I don't think Logan is actually saying anything here. He says, I'd give up whole books by many poets for Hutchinson's lines. And he cites these 2.5 lines. And they're good lines. But I would give up whole books by many poets for nothing, for free. And in fact, I do. There are so many books by so many poets that I have no desire to read and will never read, and happily and thoughtlessly give up all the time for zero compensation, let alone for the compensation of 2.5 good lines of poetry. So this just seems like, name me a poet. Like, tell me who. Tell me whose books of poems you would give up for these 2.5 lines. And then you'll be saying something. But as it is, you are literally saying nothing. Like, you'd give up whole books by many poets for these lines? That's not a statement. You love this guy. This is your guy. Give us, like, up the ante. Come on, William. He's worth more than that. So after reading this review of Hutchinson and coming to the conclusion that it really is the absence of voice in Hutchinson's poems, again, I have not read him a great deal. I've read what poems of his I've read feel to me not really to have a voice, but merely to have evidence of the sort of the conscious shaping of language with great art, with great skill and talent, but I don't hear a voice speaking. After coming to that conclusion and being somewhat satisfied with myself as a crusty old bad white guy, I then read a bunch of submissions for LM, and the very first one I read was a very long submission composed of several very long poems, all by another old crusty white guy that were all very voicey, they're all very much had recognizable voice to them, and they were just absolutely deadly dull. It felt like a punishment for not liking Ishii and Hutchinson's poems. This was some of the dullest dog shit I've ever read. And it's not even like it was bad. Like it was clear, the language was original, the subject matter was not especially hackneyed. The lines were often sort of had a kind of an integrity to them, even if they weren't formally shaped. It wasn't that, like, it ticked all the boxes of, like, not bad poetry, but it was just relentlessly boring. This is something, so Josh wrote in a while ago to say, like, we did our episode on boredom, and I kind of said that, like, boredom on its own doesn't feel to me like the standing threat of daily life. But I do, and I think he said similarly that, like, boredom wasn't, he's not been bored in a long time. Where I realized I was not quite telling the truth is that I don't feel boredom come over me. But what I do experience is subjecting myself to bad art, or sometimes good art, I guess. Art that I should find good if I were a better person, and being bored by it. And this was maddening to me because I did, reading the boring long poems of this guy. I'm not bad, like the boring, fine long poems of this, who also like submitted so many poems. Don't submit. All right, okay. Most poetry magazines have a maximum number of poems you can submit. Rule of thumb. If you submit the maximum number of poems, don't make all of them the maximum length possible. Don't submit the maximum number of poems and have them all be long poems. Your editors will hate you for this. But come back to the boring guy. I of course, because I just had this experience with Hutchinson, I thought, like, all right, why am I, like, I do hear this guy's voice. Like, I definitely hear this guy droning on in my head. Like, truly what came to mind was not any other poem, but the energy vampire from What We Do in the Shadows. Just yammering on, just droning on. Like, he was talking about things, and it wasn't that, like, they did have to do with one another, and they weren't intrinsically, like, I could imagine a good poem about any of the subject matter of any of the subjects that he chose for the poems, but they were just deadly. And I really tried to think about, like, okay, why is that? Because what was funny is that while with Hutchinson, I felt an additional difficulty of sometimes trying to step back and reconstruct the denotation of the sentence. It's like, it's not that I'm so stupid that I don't know what the words mean when I read them, but like sometimes with very dense verse, I do have to kind of take a second reading of the line to say, like, all right, let me picture in my mind, what is he actually saying? What is the actual arrangement that he is narrating of these elements? And like, that is an additional labor that one has to perform that I didn't have to perform with Boring Guy. But what was strange is that I did feel very similarly a kind of laboriousness to the process of like going from one line to another, from one sentence to another, from one stanza to another. I kept thinking to myself, like, all right, here we go, one more. Well, let's go. All right, how many more of these we got to go? All right, let's get on to the next one. Here we go. Let's do it. And I think what I finally settled on, and this is not this, again, it's another idea I haven't totally worked out, but like what I think I have settled on is that, yes, I do think voice matters to me, at least. Like, I really do feel like I need to hear something that resembles a voice. Voice clearly isn't enough. And I also was reminded of that also reading through, still, like, part of why it has taken me so long to get all the way through all of the Dream songs. 3 reasons. One is that there are a lot of Dream songs. 2, much more relevant, is that I have all this other stuff I also keep reading in the middle and then going back to the Dream songs. But 3 is that most of them are really not great. And they are very voicey. Like, they are very recognizably a voice, even though, that voice is often sort of performatively split. I mean, he writes in multiple voices in the Dream songs, but they all, at all moments, it sounds like Berryman. But often he's just yammering. He's just talking about doing some shit in a pub in Ireland and some guy he read and felt jealous of or envious of. I don't feel as if, what I don't feel often, very often with the Dream songs, was what I don't feel with Boring Guy, which is what I don't feel with Hutchinson, which is that any of them is telling me any of this for a reason. Like, on purpose. Like, because he cares that I hear it. All of them seem to be talking just to be heard. Just like they take it as a given that I should be hearing them. Or like, maybe they don't. Maybe they don't care. Maybe they're just talking and I happen to be in the room. But either way, what they're definitely not doing is telling me this on purpose. So I will say this, I think this is not embarrassing. I think this is actually sweet and nice and wholesome. But I will say a thing, maybe Joanna will yell at me about this, but I don't think so, because like I read a poem about the Rattlecast. I should have introduced the fucking show at some point. I never did. I realized this is SLEERICKETS. It is a podcast. Thank you for listening. Please do sign up for the secret show. It really makes a difference in being able to do this show. Go to sleerickets.substack.com. You will get not just an extra episode every week, but like 70 plus episodes now that are up on there. Like, you get all of that, access to all of that. It's a lot of really good stuff. A lot of it is gossipy and juicy and fun in the bad way that this podcast is fun, and the guilty pleasure way that this podcast attempts to be a guilty pleasure. What else? Also, I was on the Rattlecast. It was great. Thank you to Tim. Thank you to all of you who did watch live. I was very touched by that, though I realized the second it started that I couldn't actually see the chat, and so I had no idea what the chat was saying, which was probably just as well. But it has also been recorded, so you can go watch it now. I'll put a link in the show notes to it. And I think it came out pretty well. I think. Yeah, I think it did. But anyway, I read a poem there about having sex with my wife, which sounds now so much more alarmingly personal to say. Like, I've just admitted that I have actually had sex with my wife. In public, of all places. But she really likes that poem, and she likes when I read it, so I think that is good and okay, because it is okay. Yeah, it's like good and okay. It's okay to have sex with your wife. Yes. I bring all this up because the thing that came to mind with Hutchinson and Boring Guy and Berryman in many of his dream songs, not all of them, but in many of his dream songs, when he's just sort of going on, just Berryman being Berryman, is this rule Joanna and I have between us. It is I live in a naked house. I live in a house of naked girls. Through 2 daughters, a bitch dog, very sweet bitch, very sweet, delightful, gentle, sweet, anxious, loving, tender, devoted bitch. Echo the golden doodle, and my lovely wife. And they're all girls, and the natural tendency is just for there to be constant female nakedness. It's a very clothed male house. The male components of the male. I keep my clothes on. I'm not a never nude like Tobias Funke, but I am a seldom nude. I'm nude only in completely appropriate times. But we have this rule we worked out several years into our marriage, Joanna and me, which was this. The rule is you can let... Obviously, this does not apply to the girls for many reasons. But between just the two of us, just the married people, two people married to each other, here's our rule. You can let the other person, the spouse, you can let your spouse see you naked only if you are doing it on purpose. That is, you can permit the other person to see you naked, but it has to be because you want the other person to see you naked. You can't just not wear pants because you're lazy, because you forgot. Maybe that seems really draconian to some of you. I'm sure to Brian in Socialist Brooklyn, it seems crypto-fascist. But I think it's kind of a good rule for us. Like, we sort of like the rule. We're like because part of what it means is if you see me naked, it's because I want that to happen, and I am hoping that it will have an effect on you. Like, it's something I'm doing to you. It's not just something that happens to be the case about me. It is something that you are being invited to participate in something, so to speak. Again, it is so shameful to publicly acknowledge that I have sex with my wife, but sadly it's true. It is, it's just, we have to face facts, folks. But that's sort of like, that was what I thought with, Hutchinson is so talented and eminent and well-respected that, like, in the imaginary world in which he actually heard this, he should still ignore it. But I think when I see it, when I read a poem, I feel like the poet is getting naked in front of me. And I want it to be for a reason. Like, I don't want it to be that, like, I just walked in and, like, or worse, that he's like doing a Lyndon Johnson to me. Lyndon Johnson would just, like, be naked in front of his aides, just, like, to be a dick about it. I mean, literally, to be a dick about it. And he didn't, and it certainly was not for their benefit, or not their benefit in any, like, normal way that they would appreciate. I don't want that. I don't want poets to Lyndon Johnson me. I don't want them to streaker me. I don't want them to Winnie the Pooh me, or what do they call it at Burning Man? To shirt cock me. Like, I don't want that. If you are gonna get naked in front of me, I want it to be because you want me to see you naked. Obviously, this does not apply to my daughters or my dog, although she is a huge slut. Yeah, but I think this is a terrible, tragically ill-conceived analogy, but I think that's really it. Like, I think that's why I was so bored by Boring Guy and by Hutchinson and by Berryman when he's just Berrymaning. When he's Berrymaning willy-nilly without regard for the reader. And like when he says things like, these poems are not meant to be understood. That's partly it. Like that's part of, I think, my feeling with him saying that, with people saying that about Ashbery, with people saying like, oh, why are you so eager to understand these poems? Why do you care so much about paraphrase? Oh, you want to understand. But like part of me feels like, no, you're shirt cocking me. Like stop shirt cocking me. Stop LBJing me. Stop Winnie the Pooh. Like stop. You're weirdly being naked in front of me, and I don't know what to do about it. Just as I awkwardly told my grandmother that she was a bad poet by accident. I did not know that. I similarly, in college, there was a very forward girl in my drama class who invited me to her dorm room one night and took off all of her clothes and said she was tired and got into bed. And I was really confused, and I thought, well, if you were so tired, why did you invite me over here? And then I left because that's what you do when someone goes to bed. So she was not shirt-cocking me. She was not, but I thought she was. I thought she was just being a weird person taking her clothes off when she should have just gone to, you were just tired. Why did you invite me over? This is ridiculous. You were so inconsiderate. But I figured I will finish with something unequivocally good. Maybe not unequivocally good, but like very good, sincerely good. This is a poem by Catherine Tufariello, written a few years ago, like in poetry world, like very recently. This was in Literary Matters. I was really glad when we published this. It's called Second Act Problems. It is pretty long, so I'll probably read it only once, but I will just say, I think it's quite clear. It is about Second Act Problems. The epigraph is from David Mamet's 3 Uses of the Knife, an excellent book on plot. It's very, very slender. It's like 90 pages. Very good book on plot by David Mamet. The quotation is, "Solutions to the problem of the middle act are the test of character." Solutions to the problem of the middle act are the test of character. That is, if a play conventionally has 3 acts, then coming up with the premise is one thing. Coming up with the climactic conclusion is another thing. Coming up with those complications in the middle that get you from one to the other. That's, as he says, the test of character. Tufariello writes about this in terms of fairy tales and fables and unrealistic stories reaching a difficult second act. And then it takes a turn and it becomes maybe about our lives. And I'm not entirely of one mind about this poem. I can anticipate Cameron's objection is that the language is too plain and it goes on too long. She makes her point. She should make her point in a really compressed way with vortex-like gunpowder-charged language and 7 lines. And it's true. She goes on. She is not merely making her point. She does not end at the sharpest, most cutting moment or the brightest image. There is something fundamentally middle-aged about this poem. And it even makes me think about second acts for poets. The middle career, right? Poetry's a young man's game and it's an old man's game. There's not really anything like essentially interesting about a middle-aged poet. But that's mostly what we are. And I think that's in part what this poem's about. Not just poets, but all of us. So I'll read it once. This has been a very long episode, so I will just I'll just read it the once, and I think you'll get it. Second Act Problems by Catherine Tufariello. Solutions to the problem of the middle act are the test of character. David Mamet, 3 Uses of the Knife. The princess wanders spellbound in a wood. The prophets in the belly of a whale. The empire overwhelms the force of good. Deep in the muddled middle of the tale. The noble cause to which the hero kneeled devolves to meetings, columns, and reports. A mentor's impure motives are revealed. through the intestines of appellate courts. The case for justice crawls. Dorothy waits, watching the red sand run. The rebels mourn. Snow White is elbow deep in greasy plates. George Bailey wishes he was never born. I'll stop here just briefly to say, I think the real masterpiece of the real extraordinary achievement of this poem is an alternate portrait of George Bailey that she develops a little bit later in the poem. George Bailey, the hero of It's a Wonderful Life, who wishes he was never born, attempts suicide, and an angel shows him what life would be like without him, and he learns that he's really essential to making the world the kind of place it is, and he becomes very grateful at the end, and then the whole town rallies around him and saves the day. She offers a different portrait of him, and maybe a more... It's funny because it's realistic, not in the direction one expects. It's not just, the princess finds that the prince is sort of a cad, or that he gets a little fat, or he watches too much football. It's something else. It's more about compromises one makes morally. And that's some of what she suggests here with the noble cause to which the hero kneeled devolves to meetings, columns, and reports. Right? It's one thing to lead a rebellion. It's another thing to establish a government. So that is part. I think that's where this poem becomes most interesting. Is not in its. It's not merely. This is not merely an overturning of fairy tales. This is not merely like, da-da-dum. What if all fucking my daughters read these fairy tale retellings, and God bless them, but come on. Sleeping Beauty, only she's not Sleeping Beauty because she doesn't fall asleep. She saves her own day by leading the kingdom leading the bad fairy to realize that she was invited after all, and then she teaches her to read. I think that's fine, but what are we doing here? Just tell a new story. Just come up with a new good story instead of doing a bad version of this story. So this is not cracked fairy tales, crooked fairy tales. This is not about the life in the fairy tale becoming less picturesque. This is about the human being in the fairy tale becoming less of an ideal, becoming a little less pure-hearted. Maybe the love is a little less true. And I'll start over. The princess wanders spellbound in a wood. The prophets in the belly of a whale. The empire overwhelms the force of good, deep in the muddled middle of the tale. The noble cause to which the hero kneeled devolves to meetings, columns, and reports. A mentor's impure motives are revealed through the intestines of appellate courts. The case for justice crawls. Dorothy waits, watching the red sand run. The rebels mourn. Snow White is elbow deep in greasy plates. George Bailey wishes he was never born. Truth is elusive in the second act. The mind renews in endless permutations its quest for some plain clarifying fact. Inconsequential lies hold implications, looming like ships through fog. And all the while, time drains away in aimless afternoons. Checklists and compromises, briefs to file, till failure, like a field of poppies, croons, "You've tried so hard. Lie down and get some rest." None of it matters now. Shame drops the knife. In life, sometimes we learn surrender's best. Dorothy gives the witch her shoes. In life, George ends up, through small deficits of will, as Potter's partner. Mary and the kids live in the nicest house in Pottersville. George golfs on Sundays. Losers on the skids no longer ask his help. But now and then, nursing his final beer, he sits awake, vaguely unsettled by the boy again, pulling his brother from an icy lake. And Alice, bored, spends evenings playing bridge, having not quite forgotten Wonderland. Drink me, she thinks, and rifles through the fridge. She sighs, the bottle cool against her hand. A window frames the rising moon. A frost of condensation glistens on the glass. It's here the battle will be won or lost. Make no mistake. The neutral seconds pass. I'm totally of two minds about those last two stanzas. Like, part of me thinks the poem should end pulling his brother from an icy lake. I do think those two stanzas about George Bailey and that other world those are the ones that just most tear at me. Maybe that's a reflection of my own guilt. Not that I golf on Sundays, but... And then Alice, I hear a little bit of an echo of a joke that Alicia Stallings makes in one of her Alice poems about Drink Me. But I also partly imagine that the Alice in this poem is Alicia Stallings. Still magical, but also like an ordinary mom and wife. And she's not, there's a version of this poem where Drink Me would be Alice is an alcoholic now. I don't think she is here. I think she's just maybe a little disappointed in herself and in her life. Maybe it's just that she hasn't really, that it's not what she thought it would be. And the last stanza is in some ways the least settled, like the least resolved. It's least clear what it's doing. A window frames the rising moon. A frost of condensation glistens on the glass. This is very good. This is clear and crisp and pretty and shapely. And the meter is very regular, but not thudding, because she actually has an ear for it, because she actually knows what she's doing. But these are lines that are, I think, not hard to write if you are used to writing meter and rhyme well. So then it's here the battle will be won or lost. Again, that's almost a throwaway line, except that it's in this moment we're what, in the kitchen? We're in the house. It's quiet. You've kind of arrived at your midlife, past midlife probably at this point. Late, what we call midlife now, which is actually late in life. It's here the battle will be won or lost. There's something sort of terrifying about that claim now. That it's in moments like these that if we have any moral fiber, it shows itself. And for the most part, it doesn't. Make no mistake, the neutral seconds pass. Time doesn't really care one way or the other, whether you're good or bad. Whether or not you do the right thing, whether or not you've proven to be what you hoped you would. But also, the neutral seconds pass, meaning the seconds during which things might still turn out one way or the other. Those pass. And what eventually arrives is the time when it's settled. It's done. There's no changing now. I'll read just the end of the poem again because I think it's so good. In life, George ends up through small deficits of will. That's a really nice way of putting that. I mean, subtle. It's not an exciting way of putting it, but I just think it's a compassionate and accurate way of putting it. In life, George ends up through small deficits of will as Potter's partner. Potter's the bad guy in It's a Wonderful Life. He's the greedy banker guy. In life, George ends up through small deficits of will as Potter's partner. Mary and the kids live in the nicest house in Pottersville. George golfs on Sundays. Losers on the skids no longer ask his help. But now and then, nursing his final beer, he sits awake, vaguely unsettled by the boy again, pulling his brother from an icy lake. and Alice, bored, spends evenings playing bridge, having not quite forgotten Wonderland. Drink me, she thinks, and rifles through the fridge. She sighs, the bottle cool against her hand. A window frames the rising moon. A frost of condensation glistens on the glass. It's here the battle will be won or lost. Make no mistake, the neutral seconds pass. Yeah, that's partly what I mean. It's like it's very well done, but it is not, for somebody who really knows what she's doing with form, it's not the technique that impresses me. Again, like most people, very few people can do this well. But if you can do this is not that hard to do, technically speaking. What sets this poem apart is how she handles the argument. And that reveals an extremely delicate touch. Maybe that's what I was kind of saying there about form. But yeah, you would never say this poem sounds like a metronome, but it's very regular because just adding in substitutions is not what makes meter sound good. All right, I'm off on the fucking meter thing again. Anyway, that's Second Act Problems by Catherine Tuffer-Yellow, who still writes poems. Catherine, if you do happen ever to hear this, please send me some poems. We would love to publish more at Literary Matters. And I actually want to try to recruit you to publish your next book at Measure, because I want to help make Measure the fucking place to be if you write poems in verse. We're working on it. We're seriously working on it. And like seriously, let's make that happen, because you're really fucking good. You're really fucking good. And you didn't walk away from your gifts, but I am very glad that William Logan wrote that bizarre omnibus. I mean, lovely treatment of you. Bizarre in general. William, my in-group cringe tells me that in some way I identify with you, although we are not the same age. But man, you just sometimes you make us look so bad, and sometimes we make ourselves look bad. All right, that was SLEERICKETS. Fuck if I know how I'm going to edit this shit. What is this going to be, a 2-hour episode? All right. Thank you all for listening. You can write me at sleerickets@gmail.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.